An 82-year-old woman stands on her porch in the early morning light, holding a handful of breadcrumbs out toward a small black crow that looks like it hasn't eaten in weeks, and she has no idea that this single act of kindness is about to save her life because months from now, on a cold November night, two masked men will break into her home while she sleeps. And what that same crow does when it hears her scream will leave the entire neighborhood standing in disbelief. So if you've ever wondered whether the kindness you give to this world ever truly comes back to you, this story is about to answer that question in a way you will never forget. Her name was Eleanor Price, and she had lived in the same small house on Maple Ridge Lane for over 53 years, a house she had moved into as a young bride and had never once thought about leaving because every corner of it still held pieces of the life she had built with her husband, Harold, who had passed away 7 years ago from heart failure, and even though her two grown children had begged her to move closer to them in the city, Eleanor always refused because this house was more than a building to her. It was the last place where she still felt Harold's presence in the creaky floorboards and the faded curtains he had helped her pick out, and so she stayed, alone but not entirely lonely, filling her quiet days with small routines that gave her life a gentle rhythm. Every morning, Eleanor would wake up at 6, make herself a cup of tea with exactly 1 spoon of honey, and then she would walk out to the back porch where she kept a small wooden bowl filled with birdseed because feeding the birds had become her favorite part of the day, a ritual that started a few years after Harold died when she noticed a pair of sparrows landing on her fence and realized how much she missed having something alive to care for, and from that moment on, she made sure that no bird in her yard ever went hungry. The neighbors knew her as the quiet woman who kept to herself but always waved with a soft smile, the kind of person who never caused trouble and never asked for anything, and most of them assumed she was content in her solitude. But what they didn't see was the way Eleanor sometimes sat alone at her kitchen table for hours, staring at the empty chair across from her, wishing someone would just stop by and talk, wishing the phone would ring with something other than a telemarketer, wishing that her days didn't all blur together into a single long stretch of silence. That loneliness was part of why she loved the birds so much, because they didn't judge her, they didn't forget to call, they simply showed up every morning expecting nothing but a handful of seeds, and in return they gave her a reason to get out of bed. It was in the middle of January when she first noticed the crow, and it wasn't like the other birds that came to her yard because this one was smaller, thinner, and it moved with a kind of hesitation that made Eleanor stop and watch, and when she looked closer she saw that its feathers were dull and patchy, its beak slightly crooked as if it had been injured at some point, and it stayed far away from the feeder while the sparrows and finches ate freely, almost like it knew it didn't belong. Eleanor watched as the crow tried to approach the seed bowl only to be chased away by two larger birds that pecked at it aggressively, and something about the way it stumbled back and lowered its head made her heart tighten because she recognized that posture, that look of being unwanted, of being too weak to fight for a place at the table, and before she even realized what she was doing, she walked out onto the porch and scattered a small pile of crumbs a few feet away from the main feeder, placing them in a spot where the other birds wouldn't bother to go. The crow didn't move at first, it just stood there watching her with one dark eye tilted in her direction, and Eleanor didn't push. She simply stepped back slowly and whispered in a soft voice that it was okay, that no one was going to hurt it here, and then she went back inside and watched from the window. It took almost 15 minutes before the crow finally hopped over to the crumbs, and when it started eating, Eleanor felt a warmth bloom in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time, a feeling of being useful, of mattering to something, even if that something was just a scrawny bird that the world had forgotten. The next morning, she did the same thing, and the crow was already waiting near the fence when she came outside, and day after day this became their routine, Eleanor placing food in that same spot and the crow arriving a little earlier each time, trusting her a little more with every visit. By the end of the month, the crow no longer flinched when she came near, and one afternoon it did something that made her stop breathing for a second because it looked directly into her eyes and held her gaze for what felt like a full minute, and Eleanor had read somewhere that crows were incredibly intelligent, that they could recognize human faces and remember people who were kind to them, and in that moment she believed it completely because there was something in that bird's stare that felt almost human, almost grateful. She started calling it Shadow because of the way it would follow her movements from the fence, watching her water her plants or sweep the porch, always nearby but never intrusive, and she found herself talking to it the way she used to talk to Harold, telling it about her day, about the book she was reading, about the ache in her knees when the weather turned cold, and even though she knew it was just a bird, it felt like someone was finally listening. Spring came and went, and then summer, and Shadow grew stronger under Eleanor's care, its feathers glossy now, its movements quick and confident, and it still came to her yard every single day without fail, sometimes bringing small shiny objects that it would leave on her porch railing like little gifts, a bottle cap, a button, a piece of foil, and Eleanor kept every single one in a small jar on her kitchen windowsill because they meant more to her than any jewelry ever could. The neighborhood stayed quiet through those warm months, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened and people left their doors unlocked without thinking thinking twice, and Eleanor had never once felt afraid living alone because Maple Ridge Lane was safe. It had always been safe, and she had no reason to believe that would ever change. But then autumn arrived with shorter days and longer shadows, and something in the air started to feel different, though Eleanor couldn't explain what it was, maybe just the chill of the season or the way the wind rattled her windows at night. But there were moments when she would glance out the front window and notice a car she didn't recognize parked across the street, or she would hear footsteps on the sidewalk late at night and feel a strange unease settle in her chest, though she always told herself she was being silly, that her imagination was just getting the better of her in her old age. It was the second week of November when everything changed, and that night started like any other. Eleanor watching her evening program on the old television in the living room, Shadow long gone to wherever it slept when the sun went down, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. She went to bed around 9:30, the way she always did, and she fell asleep quickly, dreaming of nothing in particular, completely unaware that two men had been watching her house for days, learning her schedule, noting that she lived alone, and deciding that tonight was the night they would finally make their move. The sound that woke her wasn't loud, it was more like a scraping, a soft persistent noise coming from somewhere near the back of the house, and at first Eleanor thought it was a branch against the window, but then she heard a click, the unmistakable sound of a lock being forced, and her entire body went cold. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she wanted to scream but her voice wouldn't come, and she wanted to run but her legs felt frozen, and all she could do was listen as the back door creaked open and footsteps moved into her kitchen. There were two of them, she could tell by the sound, two sets of feet shuffling through her home like they owned it, and she heard them whispering to each other, heard drawers being opened and things being moved, and she knew she had to do something, she had to get to the phone or get out the front door, but when she tried to stand her knee buckled and she stumbled against the nightstand, knocking over a glass of water that shattered on the floor, and in that moment everything went silent. Then she heard the footsteps coming toward her bedroom, fast and deliberate, and she backed against the wall just as her door was thrown open and two figures in black ski masks filled the doorway, and one of them had a knife that caught the dim light from the hallway, and Eleanor felt a terror unlike anything she had ever known because she understood in that moment that she was completely alone and completely helpless and no one was coming to save her. The taller one stepped forward and told her not to scream, told her to hand over her valuables and no one would get hurt, but his voice was cold and his eyes through the mask were empty, and Eleanor couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but tremble as tears ran down her face. And that's when they all heard it, a sound that made everyone freeze, a loud sharp tapping against the bedroom window, followed by a screech that cut through the silence like a blade, and when Eleanor looked toward the glass she saw a shape in the darkness, black wings spread wide, beaks striking the window over and over, and she knew immediately that it was Shadow. The men looked at each other, confused by the noise, and in that moment of distraction the window suddenly shattered inward, glass flying everywhere, and Shadow came through like a bullet, wings beating furiously, going straight for the face of the man holding the knife, claws raking across his eyes, beak pecking with a fury that seemed impossible for such a small creature, and the man screamed, dropping the knife and stumbling backward, swinging his arms widely but unable to get the bird off him. The second man tried to grab Shadow but the crow was too fast, darting and diving, screeching at a volume that echoed through the entire house, and then something miraculous happened because that sound carried out into the quiet neighborhood, waking neighbors who had been asleep for hours, and within seconds lights were turning on in every house on the block. The two intruders panicked, the one who had been attacked still bleeding from deep scratches on his face, and they bolted out of the bedroom, tripping over each other as they fled through the back door, and outside they ran straight into Tom Brennan from next door who had grabbed a baseball bat when he heard the screaming, and his wife had already called the police, and within minutes sirens were filling the air. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, shaking so violently she could barely breathe, and somewhere in the chaos Shadow had landed on the windowsill, watching her, waiting, its feathers ruffled and one wing slightly bent from the impact of breaking through the glass, and when Eleanor looked at the bird she felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away since Harold died, because she realized that she had never truly been alone, that this creature she had shown kindness to had never once forgotten it, and in her darkest moment it had come back for her with everything it had. The police arrested both men before they could get off the street, and the EMTs checked Eleanor for injuries and found none, though they said her blood pressure was dangerously high and wanted to take her to the hospital, but she refused to leave until she knew Shadow was okay. And when the officers heard the story of what the crow had done they stood there in stunned silence because none of them had ever heard of anything like it. The story spread through the neighborhood by morning, and then it spread beyond, picked up by local news, shared on social media, becoming one of those rare stories that reminded people that the world is still capable of wonder. Eleanor never forgot that night, and neither did Shadow, who returned to her yard the very next day as if nothing had changed, though Eleanor noticed it walked with a slight limp now from the injured wing, and she made sure to give it extra food and speak to it a little longer each morning, and sometimes when she looked into its dark eyes she could swear she saw Harold looking back at her, telling her that she was never as alone as she thought she was. The jar of shiny objects on her windowsill grew fuller over the years, and Eleanor kept every single gift, and when people asked her what her secret to happiness was, she would simply smile and say that kindness has a way of finding its way back to you, even when you least expect it, even when you think no one is watching, because somewhere out there something remembers, something knows, and when the time comes, it won't hesitate to fight for you the way you once fought for it. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you that even the smallest acts of compassion can ripple outward in ways we never imagine, then comment the word kindness below to let me know you believe that good deeds always come back. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who might be feeling invisible or forgotten, please share this story with them, because sometimes the smallest reminder can change everything. And I'll see you in the next one.